and welcome to Lip Service, a podcast that adventures around and all down the line with the Rolling Stones. Please allow me to introduce myself. My name is Simon Harper, and I shall be your host for this series of conversations that celebrate the life and music of the greatest rock and roll band in the world. We've got sights and sounds and marvels to delight your eyes and ears, so join us as we journey down the road a piece, from Dartford days to Hackney Diamonds and beyond, exploring the songs and stories from along the way with friends and special guests. Today's guest is Prince Stanislas Klossowski de Rola, better known to friends and fans as Prince Stash. The son of the renowned painter Balthus and raised in a straight-laced European household steeped in art and philosophy, Stash came of age in the cultural epicentre of 1960s London and Paris, living at the crossroads of la dolce vita and the burgeoning rock revolution. Actor, dandy and musician, he was not only a Zelig-like figure of the counterculture, but a close companion to some of its most magnetic characters. Most notably, the Rolling Stones' founding guitarist, Brian Jones. In this conversation, we explore Stash's unique perspective as a trusted friend and confidant of the Stones during their most transformative and tumultuous years. He shares rich memories of his deep bond with Brian, their infamous and, in his words, farcical drug bust of 1967, and the creative electricity of the Stone he refuses to call a victim. We talk about his friendship with the Beatles, his cultivated image, the impact of the bust on his career, as well as his heartbreaking end to a decade often romanticised. From sharing clothes and stage time to recording music that still hasn't been heard, Stash was there, not just in the room, but shaping the mood. This is the story of a prince, a poet, and a true original who saw it all and lived to tell the tale. Speaking to me from his fairy tale castle in Italy, this is Prince Stash. Prince Stash, welcome to Lip Service.
Well, thank you for having me, Simon.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you here. Yours is an exotic life of intrigue and artistic adventure, so I'm looking forward to hearing all about it.
Indeed.
Well, let's start at the beginning. Like all good stories, your father was the renowned artist Balthus, and you grew up in what some would call a bohemian lifestyle in Europe. How do you think your childhood shaped your artistic sensibilities?
I don't know if bohemian would fit the mold. It was a very, very much a 18th or 19th century sort of childhood, replete with great, splendid, stately homes and lots of staff, and one wasn't really that much in contact with the grown-ups, except there were intermediaries, there were footmen and nannies and the rest of it.
So very
So
separated.
it was hardly bohemian. I would say that Bohemia started for me when, mercifully, my childhood died in Rome in 1959 when I was discovered by Luchino Visconti's assistant and persuaded to do a test, which, never mind that it didn't really lead to much in terms of a career as such, but it led to marvelous adventures in the dolce vita and started me on a road to hobnobbing with all kinds of extraordinary individuals, including great playboys, jazzmen, legendary names in jazz, and eventually would lead me to be a professional in the rock world, which I was very attracted to ever since I was a kid.
I mean, children often rebel against their parents. Were you destined to go into life in the arts, do you think?
I did. There was a complete, it's a bit of a misnomer that it wasn't your classic rebellion, but yes, I did have tremendous rebellious tendencies, which led to my hating boarding school and to my eventually being sent to the UK, in fact, to Devonshire, Dartmoor, um, and having Eric Otto Sipman as my tutor. And that led to all kinds of wonderful adventures and so on.
So you mentioned your screen test. It was in 1961 that you acted in your first movie, Les Démons de Minuit. What were your
Right.
aspirations as an actor? Was that something you wanted to pursue professionally?
Yes, I was convinced I would be some sort of movie star, and went to Hollywood in pursuit of that. I was also interested in the technical aspects of filmmaking and learned the rudiments of cinematography and all sorts of things like that. And I had the privilege of having a very interesting time as a 20-year-old in Hollywood.
Oh, I can bet.
Because in those days it was, you could actually be an intern on a production without being an unpaid slave, which is the case today. An unpaid slave who cannot hobnob with anybody. I was an honored guest on all the sets and all the things I participated in Hollywood at that time. When I returned from there in 19 early 1963, I joined an old friend of mine in late, I got back, yes, I got back in late 63, early 64, I found myself in Paris and joined an old friend of mine who said, because I couldn't find the right occupation in the film business. So he said, why don't you join the band? And that was Vince Taylor's band. And you know about Vince Taylor. He was this extraordinary figure, a kind of sexier version of Gene Vincent, a UK national who grew up in the US, first in New Jersey and then in California. So he was a sort of Anglo-American, and he played on the American side of himself and came back to England with a new form of rock and roll. Oddly enough, his career uh, didn't take off as it should have in England due to the fact that this great rock classic, Brand New Cadillac,
Hmm.
was put on the B side rather than the A side of the original release in England. But Brand New Cadillac ended up being is a signature tune for a lot of bands and was covered by tons of people, including The Clash on the
That's right.
London is Calling album.
Yeah.
Well, that my friendship with Vince Taylor started in 61, but then I'd gone to America in 62 and didn't return until, as I say, until the end of 63. I joined the band in 64. Um, Various misadventures happened, but then I was on this as a full-fledged member. I went on a tour of Spain with Vince Taylor's band, and then the word came in that we would be what was known as vedette américaine, meaning that we would be co-topping the bill, sort of, with the Rolling Stones. The
Right.
Rolling Stones, but we wouldn't be opening in the classic sense that it's understood today,
Like sharing a
because
bill, basically.
we shared the bill, but there were also possibly 15 acts that preceded us who played one or two songs. There was also a magician who did, rabbits out of hats and things like that. I mean, it was a very eclectic show at the Paris Olympia during the 1965 Easter holiday. So it was several gigs all in a row at the Paris Olympia. And we came straight back from this very successful tour of Spain, and in full form, and the Stones found it quite difficult time to follow, because we wooed their own fans who'd followed them, and it was our first encounter with them. They were standing in the wings watching everything we did, and I've often told the story of how Mick Jagger tartly asked Vince Taylor on the way as we walked off the stage drenched. He said, "You been on like that, you know?" And Vince just blew past him and said, "No, we've been rehearsing," and just never broke stride. And whereas Brian Jones came to me, and we locked eyes, and he was very complimentary, and we became fast friends, and I took over and uh, took 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 everybody out to all the clubs, and then we ended up at Donald Camel, the future director of performance's
Right.
apartment in Montparnasse. The funny thing, which has never been highlighted because Anita Pallenberg kept it quiet, was that she was with me that during those nights, and she met Brian Jones and met the Stones for the first time then. And the official narrative is that she only met a few months later in Munich, when she did hook up with Brian Jones. But that time she couldn't, we were very free sexually speaking, and we found it extremely naff to have anything to do with monogamy, so we would never have had any claims. So if Anita had been able to seduce Brian, but she couldn't, he was with Zuzu, and who was also an old girlfriend of mine, and there was no getting away. Finally, all the accounts about the Stones that night are a bit muddled up, but Anita, myself, accompanied Brian and Zuzu back to his hotel on Boulevard des Capucines, and there were these young girls sleeping on the pavement, and we staggered out of this cab, and these girls sleeping on kind of spread out newspapers got up blurry-eyed with Instamatic cameras and started a deluge of flashes. And it would have been great fun. I've always hoped that some photographs would emerge. Somebody somewhere would have had these strange picture of these weird people staggering out of this cab, which was the four of us, but it never turned up so far.
You mentioned that there was a bit of an instant connection between you and Brian then. What do you think was the spark that ignited your friendship that day?
I don't know. Bill Wyman in Stone Alone records that moment. We became fast friends. We became lifelong friends, and we never we all had our different courses. They went to America and so on, but we remained friends till the end of his life, sort
Yeah.
of thing. Yeah.
You mentioned in a previous interview that you and Brian, you kind of recognized in him the first time that you shared a certain recklessness. You refer to yourself as dangerous people. Do you think it was apparent even then that Brian's decadence could potentially impact the band's professionalism?
Um, no, because Brian was very much, despite everything that has been said, and to my mind, a lot of Brian is now painted as some sort of a victim all along of a conspiracy between Andrew, Mick, and Keith. But Brian was living high on, had his own scene going on in Windsor when he was living with Linda Lawrence
Yeah.
at her parents' house. So, he didn't participate in the initial uh, songwriting attempts because he just physically wasn't there. He was in Windsor, very comfy, and he didn't share the fairly squalid conditions that make Keith and Andrew shared. They were not very comfortable then.
Yeah, so there was literally like a physical separation.
There was a physical separation, but it had nothing to do with estrangement. I mean, Brian was very much, you can tell in all the early interviews that Brian is the man in charge, that everybody else is very tentative. Keith is still very shy. Make. He was always kind of, he was a lead vocalist, the LV syndrome, so he was always up front and he was quite loud and thank God, he could do these things, and it's a great disservice, I think, to the memory of Brian Jones to paint him as an early victim of power plays within the band. They were young guys. There were some issues, like there always are, over girls, over money, over various situations that had been occurring. But this attitude that modern fans of Brian, who possibly weren't even born when he died, or barely born, were infants, they just have a view that he was some sort of an accursed individual. His only troubles really occurred after we were busted in 1967. When we were busted, let's there was a definite conspiracy, it's been admitted by everybody, to decapitate the Rolling Stones, perceived as a menace to society. So, due to a comedy of errors, there'd been the farcical Redlands raid,
Yeah.
and the day that we were arrested in London was the day Mick and Keith were up on trial. Uh, they'd chosen that very day and had the drug squad had alerted the press to the extent that there was a TV crew posted on the street opposite the door across the street from Courtfield Road, where we had come back from the Cannes Film Festival via Paris, by the way. And that entire thing was a planned bust, which we couldn't believe that it was happening, because and so many the press had been tipped off, as I said, and the phone rang off the hook nonstop. Have you been busted yet? And all that. And people wanted to know, and we were in sheer disbelief. We couldn't anticipate. In fact, we wondered if there were any illegal substances, and if so, where do we begin to look? Because to our knowledge, there was nothing in the apartment. So when they came, they immediately found some things which were obviously planted, and the rest was traces of useless subs. There was a thousandth of a grain of cocaine, things like that. So it was just ludicrous, and it was that led to tremendous problems for Brian, who then became estranged from the band due to his own uh, ill advice that he received from his legal team. The only person he would see at the time was me.
Mm.
And he was told to stay away from the rest of the Stones. He became very paranoid, and he also took the wrong kind of drugs at that time. In this case, mandrax, which had, coupled with alcohol, had a devastating effect on his physical well-being, on his nerves, on his mental stability. He became kind of a wreck. And from that moment on, things started to go downhill. But it's not until then, whatever there was before, whatever disagreements that might have arisen, Brian, until that time, uh, the time that I spent at Courtfield Road before we went to Cannes and all that was a very happy moments. There were never any indications that, and in Rome we were all together, and there was never indications of any ostracism of Brian, any tendencies for him to be estranged from the rest of the band at all. I mean, all these accounts are nonsense to the contrary. Because I was in the studio with them many times.
Hmm.
He ruled in the studio. For instance, Ruby Tuesday, I was there when he laid down the recorder track. And and he said, "I've got to do it again." I said, "Why? It was perfect." He said, "No, it was a quarter of a tone off. I'm
Right.
doing it again." That was Brian. He was a real perfectionist, and he was really on it. And everybody was in awe of him at that time.
Well, everybody
That
talks about how he could pick up an instrument and play it immediately. Did he have those qualities as a musician?
Yes, he did, but it doesn't mean that he could master the instrument. He just was very effective with it. He had the ability to be effective with anything he picked up. I always point out that Painted Black, there's no great sitar master would have been able to do better because they wouldn't have thought along those lines.
To play it
And
like that.
Brian had a great musical culture with other people didn't have. Not only in R&B, but for instance, he and I were interested in the roots of flamenco. So we found in Morocco these records called La Musique Andalouse, which was the Arabian roots of flamenco from the Andalusian Muslim kingdom then. And it was remarkable. And you hear that those kind of things in things like Painted Black.
Well, Brian was originally the kind of the blues purist, the guy that wanted to keep the Stones on that track. But then you say that he had this affection for.
That's such absolute nonsense.
Right. So
I don't
explain a little bit.
understand. I don't understand why they call Brian a blues purist. He was an R and there's a big difference between acoustic blues and the kind of thing that fascinated Brian, the R&B of people like Little Walter, uh, Howling Wolf, Slim Harpo. You can see all the covers the Stones chose to do on their first album, where what they were listening to in what were called in America race records.
Yeah.
That's why you had a treasure trove of tunes that people just didn't know about because they weren't even played on white radio in the States.
So tell me your take then on Brian's kind of adventurousness and inventiveness with instruments. Mick and Keith are composing these songs, but Brian's adding a different element to it. What do you think his vision was for what the Rolling Stones music could be or should be?
Well, he had a knack to add, songwriting is a knack. Brian had this uncanny musical ability, but if it didn't, but he was quite lazy about something that wouldn't come to him. So in songwriting, it was pathetic that he lyrically couldn't come up with anything better than your your archetypal uh, violets are blue, roses are red, and I love you type of thing. It was absurdly pathetic, and he knew it. And so he stayed away from the songwriting things. He could write melodies and things like that, but he couldn't put them into songs. That's why at one point he thought I was a word master, and he recruited me to do some proto rap type of music, which we unfortunately have been looking for the tapes for a long time because we had these kind of spoken word uh, uh, tapes where Brian would get elaborate melodies and compelling rhythms too. But there were sketches for that sort of thing. Oddly enough, he said, he didn't say, oh, this is for a solo project. He said, do you mind if we do that for the Stones? Because he intended the Stones to go in that direction. Hence, his initial enthusiasm for satanic majesties and the direction that was taking. So to call him a blues purist, I mean, there were dreadful British musicians such as Cyril Davis, who were really pathetic people aping the the style, even the ill way of pronouncing words of the black American musicians. There was, when you listen to British blues, with the possible exception of John Mayall, it's pretty dire, let's face it. Long John Baldry, all these people.
It's
So
quite sterile, isn't it, in comparison?
to call Brian a blues purist and to reduce him to that, no, going back to the roots and all that kind of thing is very different. But the roots were uh, Rolling Stone, where things like that, Muddy Waters, where that kind of sound was going back to the roots, and that's what Brian was attached to in a sense, but was very very adventurous in that field.
Something else that was adventurous was the fashion sense that you and Brian shared. You had this very much the same aesthetic. This was at a time when I suppose the Stones were still on the edges of the establishment and seen as quite dangerous. Did you face the same criticisms and pressures that the Stones faced due to their image?
Constantly, because I was one of on the continent. I was probably one of the very first guys to have long hair, and so one was constantly under pressure for that. The girls loved it, the guys hated you and wanted to beat you up. In America, it was just dreadful. The are you a boy, are you a girl got very aggressive, and it was very unpleasant. You had to learn how to fight and to defend yourself, which was a dark aspect of the 60s, which is never. People now look at it all with rose-tinted glasses, but there was a lot of repression from the establishment, from people, the police, the customs. Everybody looked at you with fear and loathing, really.
Yeah, I mean, you could see that certainly from things like the John Lennon Christianity comment and the conservative Bible Belt in America. But then you also get the impression that aside from the music coming out of London, that maybe the sort of the attitudes didn't travel very far outside of London in the 60s.
Yeah, I mean, it was, this whole. I was part of, in 1965, I was part of this fledgling um, hippie movement, uh, but hippie de luxe, as we used to joke about, because I had, we, Bobby Woodman Clark was a drummer, probably the first drummer who played with double bass drums, who was in our band and who also played with Johnny Halliday, and uh, there were he was revered by drummers such as Ringo Starr and Charlie Watts. In fact, the very first Rolling Stone I ever met was back in 1964 in the Pigalle apartment of Bobby Woodman Clark, who Charlie came over and we smoked joints and listened to jazz records an entire night. There was that was the very first time I met anybody from the Rolling Stones.
What impression did you have of
Which
Charlie from the beginning?
we didn't. We subsequently we spent quite a lot of time together because, for instance, in '76 we spent a lot of time. He came and stayed with me in Switzerland, and we would go to museums and look at art together. So we had an interest in art in common, and of course in jazz and music. And I'd been around in when I first in my teens, and in back in 1960 I was still 17. I would turn only 18 in October. So in throughout 1960, I hung out with people like Monk and whoever was in Paris.
Great,
There was
yeah.
this great big called Duke Ellington, Count Basie. All these people came through. Quincy Jones, I was friends with back then, and the Platters and all these type of people. So we had mutual interest in that sort of music, especially two people I very much learned a lot about sound and so on were Charlie Mingus and Thelonious Monk. And Monk notoriously said that there's no wrong note on the piano. And uh, I played percussion and I played guitar and all that, but now to this day I'm concentrating on keyboards and always thinking of Monk and his ideas and Mingus's interest in classical music and so on. I play intuitive music, which is based on a Baroque mode, basically.
Yeah. Just going back to the your visual aesthetic in the 60s, did that kind of element of danger um,
Oh,
provoke you?
you mean the clothes and all that sort of thing?
The clothes you were wearing, certainly yourself and Brian were being quite adventurous and wearing perhaps female clothes at times. Did
Yes,
it, did
but
it,
but
did it?
it wasn't gender bending as
No.
much as we thought that we could turn these things. The ideal was medieval tunics,
Yes.
and I modeled myself upon the graphic novel Prince Valiant. So I had the hair and the whole thing, and always looked for the only things that could be turned into kind of medieval tunics. That was the idea with Brian as well,
Right.
having these long things, these Indian inspired shirts and caftans and whatever could conjure visions of the Thousand and One Nights meets a kind of fantasy of knights of the round table type of thing.
And where would you find these things? I mean, surely they're not things that are readily available.
No, we went to antiquarians and places like that. We went to, in fact, there was Ulla Hudson had a shop that with little Slash, the future Slash of Guns N'
Ah, yes,
Roses
of
and
course.
so
Yeah,
on,
yeah.
was a little kid who was running around. And we went to all those shops and got all these type of second-hand and so-called and vintage. Now it's called vintage clothing. It was, antique in these antiquarian markets on King's Road and elsewhere.
Um,
And we also wore clothes from, there was a shop called Hung On You
yeah.
that Michael Rainey had. And, there were various shops in London where one would find odds and ends.
You had other friends outside the Stones, obviously, one of them being Paul McCartney, who you stayed with the night of the bust. How had your friendship with him and the Beatles in general developed up to that point?
I knew Paul McCartney only quite casually because he had a kind of secret, semi-secret affair at the time with a nanny of Marianne Faithfull's called Maggie, who was very beautiful and whom I'm still in touch with. In fact, it's very odd. And Paul McCartney, so I knew him only casually, and so much to my surprise, the night we were busted, we went from Chelsea police station to, and as I told you, we were filmed. As we stepped out, in fact, the footage that you can see online now of me walking into the police car comes from that crew that was posted across the street from Courtfield Road. When we arrived after a long farcical episode at Chelsea Police Station, we had Brian's rules brought in. Somebody from the office bailed us out. We jumped into a black cab and got to the Hilton Hotel, rode the elevator to the penthouse suite that uh, um, was being the Stones' new manager,
Alan
Alan
Klein.
Klein, had, and we rode and saw ourselves on the screen on the 6 o'clock news, I guess it was. And the Hilton didn't want us to stay. Alan Klein made a big fuss and threatened them with all kinds of things, and they granted us rooms there. So that, but that very night we were in the chauffeur-driven Rolls, and they tried to bust us again. And so the next day I was in the room alone. I know, and the phone rang, and I picked up, and it was Paul McCartney, and he said, "Look." I said, "Oh, Brian's." I thought he wanted to talk to Brian. I said, "He's not here." He said, "I'm not calling Brian. I'm calling you because I'm worried about you." And then he made that famous statement. He said, "Look, I pack your bags. Uh, a car is picking you up to take you to my house, and you're going to stay with me because they're going to try it again to get you. And if they do, they'll have to arrest me as well." So the Beatles rallied around me due to those circumstances. And that's how, in fact, out of that misfortune devolved that wonderful relationship with the Beatles and with Paul McCartney especially, which then evolved into a deep friendship with everybody in the Beatles, especially George Harrison and John.
Well, you apparently were sitting next to John when he composed All You Need Is Love. Is that true?
Yes, I was. We were touching. Our shoulders were touching, and he was playing an upright, and he came up with just the chords, and the only words he had was "love, love, love." Yeah.
That's a good start.
Mm.
Did the bust have any immediate repercussions on your career? Were there opportunities that you missed or challenges that you faced as a result of it?
Tremendous challenges. First of all, I couldn't. It completely torpedoed my plans. I was to join my then fiancée, Romina Power, Tyrone Power's daughter, who was a big star on the continent, and we had been picked, both of us, since we had been in 1966. We were constantly 66, 67. We'd been constantly photographed everywhere we went and chased down the street by hordes of fans and paparazzi and so on. So there was uh, a ton of that kind of uh, publicity going on, which led to John Huston casting or wanting to cast Romina and I in a film he was planning from a lovely book called A Walk with Love and Death,
Hmm.
which was a very romantic story, which ended up being a failed film since he had to recast as a result of my bust. And he took Moshe Dayan's son and his own daughter, and the film flopped completely. But I mean, I lost that big chance to finally, you know, be a star in a vehicle, which could have done a lot for me, and it was really, I mean, as I say, the silver lining was all the fun we had,
Yeah.
during those times. But on the other hand, I was, as a result, I was left without funds, um, relatively, and had to battle all this stuff. It was not a very pleasant few weeks. The police had taken my passport. Brian got to go to Monterey Pop, where I was also invited. I missed going out there.
Yeah.
It was, it had some. There was a dark side to the whole thing, and naturally, on the personal front, I was kind of bummed out because it looked really bad. It was painted to look really bad, and I didn't dare speak to my own family about it.
But Brian got some bad advice from his parents, that I believe. Did
No,
you,
not from his parents, from his lawyers.
was he speaking to the wrong people or just getting the wrong advice?
He got the wrong advice. They told him to, as I say, they told him to stay away from the other stones, not to, we should, and he then fell in bad company, and people gave him the wrong kind of drugs, and it started a road to disaster, really. Then.
With all the challenges that you faced and the missed opportunities, did it hurt more that the charges against you were dropped?
Look, what really hurt, and what was, I mean, I could have cried about it. The whole farcical aspect, when Richard Ducan was my QC, was going to defend us, the prosecution realized that the charges were so flimsy that it finally completely, in the wake of all this bust, my own notoriety got in the way of what they wanted to achieve. And when they decided not to acquit me, but to drop all charges before the trial opened, I rushed to Brian's side and said, listen, we've won the case. Now I can testify on your behalf. They're forced to drop those charges, including the one that he had allowed his premises to be, there was this ludicrous thing that they used to come up with. You allowed your premises to be used for the taking of drugs,
Yeah.
which they leveled against Keith, and they leveled it against Brian in relation to me. But Brian's staunch refusal to change his plea due to some mistaken. This was the first major disagreement we had, because I could see disaster looming. He insisted that, as his legal team had advised, he would plead guilty and throw himself on the mercy of the jury. But by pleading guilty to these completely trumped up charges, he didn't realize he was nailing his coffin shut and kissing his career goodbye, because the Lennon precedent was years in the future,
Mm-hmm.
and he would never be able to get a visa to the States, which is the main reason why he had, besides being erratic and having become, by the time he died, he'd become completely erratic and unreliable, not showing up, no longer interested, and finally the Les Barron came up with a face-saving thing that they were parting company over musical differences, but it was absolute rubbish. It had nothing to do with that. It was really that he couldn't do it anymore, and yet the door was left open. There was a very generous settlement, plus a very large annuity, and the door was left open for Brian to rejoin the band once everything could be sorted out. That is a very important distinction. Unfortunately, Alan Klein was not to be counted upon in financial terms, and his his tardiness in remitting funds was a perennial, constant problem that the Rolling Stones office faced to pay bills and so on, and so Brian, when he died, his estate was left in the red, and it wasn't until a series of lawsuits, which his father joined the Stones against Klein, that finally money that was due to Brian was eventually paid. Possibly, conceivably, if we follow that idea, he might not have died had he been able to get rid of all these builders and people who were hanging around.
Yeah, of course. I mean, he sadly died just a few weeks after he was let go by the Stones in July 1969. Where were you when you heard the news? How did it affect you personally?
I don't think any death of any individual afflicted me as adversely as Brian's death did. I was at Villa Medici, and I went raving mad in the gardens, just tears I tore through the gardens, crying and shouting and having this whole thing. I was convinced that it was a drug-induced death. And so I kept having this absurd phrase running, oh, I'm so disillusioned with drugs. And, I just was really, really badly, well, shook up is too mild a term. I was devastated. And then the worst was still to come. My first instinct was to pack my bags at once and go back to England and to attend the funeral. But then I called Robert Fraser, and Robert Fraser relayed the message that none of us were welcome to the funeral, which has then been laid, all these dreadful people laid it against us, oh, Keith, Mick, and none of you went to the funeral, and
Who
what
made the
kind of.
call? Who made the call that you guys weren't allowed?
Apparently, it was relayed, Tom Keylock was put in charge of the entire funeral by by Brian's father. So Tom Keylock selected, there was this absurd rumor that Bob Dylan had paid for the coffin, ridiculous things like that. Because, I mean, you couldn't, even in the 21st century with all the modern technology, you couldn't pay for somebody else's coffin, and sort of get it done like that. I mean, what kind of bizarre idea these legends, these urban legends, take root, and you wonder how the hell uh, that was possible. That such an absurdity would be even birthed in somebody's mind. Anyway, Tom Keylock took charge, and I guess Robert must have heard that the family was asking that we didn't go there because they felt that there was this issue that it was drug related, and that if we showed up, it would be even worse media circus than it actually turned out to be, and that the whole drug controversy of 1967 would be revisited. And, the following year, in 68, Brian had this ludicrous, again, was howled in court on another time on completely trumped up charges once again.
You have maintained a relationship with Brian's son, Julian. How has that connection influenced your perspective on Brian and his legacy?
How, well, it didn't influence me at all. I mean, I had my own, I've always, it wasn't because I knew the son and grandson, that my own, my own views of Brian uh, have never changed. The only aspects I didn't really want to get into were the dreadful events that led to his death.
Yeah.
And because I had my own deep regret that that year I didn't go down there. I didn't go down to that
Cotsford Farm.
Crossroad Farm. Yeah, I should have gone. And a few times in my life when I thought, oh, I should do such and such and didn't do it, then the people died, including my musical mentor, Ike Turner. I returned from Europe and should have gone immediately to see Ike, and then he died. It was just awful because you just feel, well, if you'd been there for somebody, maybe it would have just made the difference.
You were so young when Brian died. Did it affect your thoughts on mortality or what you wanted to do with your life?
No, because remember, I was devastated when Brian actually died, but it wasn't. We had boasted when we met. He just turned 23, I was still 22, that we wouldn't reach 25.
Right.
So, of course, he was 27 when he died, and it wasn't, but it was still, it was such a shock. And that came, Brian's death, and worse still, was then there was this tremendous tragedy, and that was Sharon Tate, whom I was extremely close to.
Yeah.
We had spent, we had been together a few weeks before she died, and in Rome when she was filming, and so she was starting her last movie, and so I hung out with Sharon quite a lot then, and very, very deep connection. And that same year, Sharon died, and I was at Woburn Abbey when that happened. It just was, it was hard. It was hard. We lost so many friends.
Yeah.
Then there was John Lennon in 1980. That was dreadful, and all along the line, all these cherished people, Jimi Hendrix, just one after the other, people, one's friends, have gone ad patres, have made the grade, as the Beatles would say.
Absolutely. Well, many people didn't survive the 60s and 70s. How do you think you did?
Lord only knows. Uh, I mean, I sometimes wonder, is it real that I'm still here, at approaching my 83rd birthday? Maybe I'll make it. It's always a question of, you always wonder, when the La Belle Dame sans merci or the Grim Reaper, whichever appellation you prefer, will come calling.
But you're still quite intact. A lot of people, didn't make it.
A lot of people didn't make it. Years ago, my son was an infant, and Keith Richards and I were together, and my former wife said to Keith, "Oh, you too," she said like that. And Keith grew very stern, and he said, yes, us too, but there used to be a lot more than us,
Right, yeah.
a
You
lot more of us.
Your friendship with Keith did endure. You guys were busted
Yes.
together in 1973. What were the
Oh, yeah.
circumstances behind that?
Well, Keith and I had been in Jamaica together and had decided to return to England together uh, in the spring of 1973, in the wake of Goat's Head Soup being finished in Jamaica.
Yeah,
So we flew back together and had endless, extraordinary adventures. Then Anita was jailed in Jamaica, which gave us a lot to do to get her out and get her back. And then when hardly had she come back, then some disgruntled boyfriend of a girl who transferred her affections to both of us, to both Keith and I, had denounced us to the police. And the police came, and we were somewhat relieved. I was relieved. I thought they were thugs coming to do us in, the
yeah.
dreadful looking people. And so circumstances were quite bizarre. I mean, and it wasn't they found traces of various things, but my bags were packed. And once again, the evidence was very, very flimsy against me personally. And that time I was acquitted, but I managed to lend support to Keith and get him acquitted on gun charges and so on, because um, there was a lot of ammunition that we had a trunk of, I had a gun permit, and a trunk of my stuff got taken to, and there was a lot, by mistake, was sent to England. There was a lot of 2.2 ammunition and things like that. And Keith did have a 38, but, you know, it went much easier once we sorted it out with, and then we had a separate trial, and then they acquitted me by jury. But we were both briefly, for a couple of hours, we were in the cell together. It was bizarre. Anyway, we, over the years, friendship endured. Uh, the son that I saw being born, virtually, Keith and I stood together when they presented the baby to us when Marlon was born. And so I saw with my own eyes Keith becoming a father for the first time. And Marlon, in turn, married. Now, this is a bit complicated, but let's put it this way. My brother's late wife, Loulou de la Falaise, had a brother, Alexis de la Falaise, and Alexis's daughter was married Marlon. So, in short, my brother is Marlon's uncle, and Marlon calls me his tenuous uncle.
That's a great connection.
So somehow and so I was at the wedding, and then there was a 25th anniversary celebration of that union at the same place in Tuscany. And that's the last time that Keith and I, we had our big reunion, and then COVID intervened, and I haven't seen him since, not because of geography. We were meant to see each other last year, but I couldn't make it. They wanted me to come to Venice, and I couldn't make it at the last moment.
Well, your main residence is in Italy, right? You're in the Monte Calvello Castle.
Yes.
And visitors can pay for a private guided tour and enjoy your company and stories. How largely do the stones figure in the questions that the visitors tend to ask you?
It depends, because there have been various categories of visitors. There have been the people who were interested in the rock and roll aspect of things, but a lot of people are interested in the esoteric side of things. I've had visitors like ceremonial magicians who are interested in this whole thing about I collect a lot of first editions and things like that. So I have a lot of Crowleyana, a lot of alchemical first editions, and so there are a lot of people connected either with the esoteric side of things who uh, who like to come along. I haven't had many rock and roll. I've had an Arab fan of old maps who came here, but what he wanted to see and talk about were ancient maps, which I have as a collection. And that's what to give you an example, Marco Visconti, who's a ceremonial magician and who wrote the Aleister Crowley handbook, he came with his consort to see me, and we talked about we looked at books and talked magic and things like that. And Stones, rock and roll, less. There are many people who would like to come, but I don't see, I can't spend all my time seeing people. Honestly,
Yeah.
I'd be doing nothing else but that. And people go, oh, why can't I be friends with you? That's why I've taken a bit of a break with social media, because it becomes rather tedious.
Yeah, but it's a good way of getting your story out there. You became somewhat of a TikTok sensation recently, and you've recorded your own podcast. So it's a good way of getting those stories out there without having to necessarily come into contact with everybody.
Yes, I mean, TikTok was a lark because uh, Sandy Grigsby and her then partner, Ken Rutkowski, since then they've gotten married and so on. Ken is a famous radio personality and the head of a group called Metal in America, which is a man's group which involves media, entertainment, technology, the arts, and leaders of various kinds. And so it's a high powered group of people. They came to visit me, and they had just come from Istanbul, where they'd done some videos uh, with a merchant, a carpet merchant they met in the Grand Bazaar. And this man uh, had enjoyed a brief, and they said, "Oh, you should do it. We should do it." And I was fairly reluctant, but I was reluctantly dragged into this thing, and suddenly it was amusing because it got fast traction, and Sandy did all the heavy lifting. She filmed. She suggested the various things, and I was more or less able to just perform as a version of myself. And then we some of our most successful videos were banned or shadow banned because of alleged nudity and from 15th century frescoes and uh, stuff like that, and incitation to violence with show a display of weaponry, and the weaponry was flintlock pistols or something like that. So it was grotesque, and she got fed up and she started posting. At the end of 2023, she started posting on Instagram. And meanwhile, there had been all this media sensation and so on. So the thing grew and grew and grew on within a short span of time. We had surpassed TikTok on Instagram and had gotten to 250,000 and was growing. And we reached an apex in last year. And then Sandy and I had only a brief sheet. They live in the Far East, in Bangkok and Cambodia and then Dubai. So we only had a certain number of days to film content, and then her own career as an advisor, and she has many clients, paying clients, whereas I was just a friend and a hobby, although we became business partners, but we never developed the financial side of things other than these few endeavors. We never marketed anything because we didn't. There was no time to do it. So in the end, it became a bit of a chore, and left to my own devices, I am not the kind of person who likes to film myself constantly and say, well, I'm doing this and I'm doing that. I just, I can't get into that kind of mentality. I always find better things to do, and that uh, much to the chagrin of my team.
Did you enjoy the reminiscing though?
I do, and it has encouraged me to finish one book, which a very transgressive version of something that had been started in the 70s, uh, a rock and roll fairy tale on Venus and Tannhauser, a very transgressive literature, hardly the kind of thing that people would tolerate in the Me Too movement. So, since I resent all that kind of censorship and all that kind of prissiness of today, I I lent into this rebellious side of mine to inflict a very to inflict this novella onto the world, and it's been serialized. I think the last episodes are in the next few weeks are coming up in on Substack. I also have excerpts from a long-suffering memoir of mine, which are also on Substack. I've yet to finish the whole book.
But I think a lot of people are going to be interested in that.
Yes, but again, it's not many times in the last 10 to 15 years, I've been approached by various publishers. It started, in fact, in 1981. Somebody said, there was a man, a journalist, uh, who had written about Brian and I, called Mike Housego. He worked for an outfit called Solo that was run by another famous journalist you probably heard of, called Don Short,
Right.
who worked at the Mirror and Daily Sketch and other things. And he had a literary agency called Solo. So Mike was sent to do a biography of me, but it was written in such desperately annoying journalese that I was really furious, and so I said to Don, "Well, this won't do." And Don said, "Well, what?" Yeah, I said, why don't you write it yourself then?" So I started writing, and he says, "Well, that ain't half bad, is it?" Well, I'm going to give it a title. So, Confessions, he said, of a living legend. I said, are you kidding? Living legend? I mean, isn't it a bit strong? He said, look, you're a legend, right? And you're still living. So it's living legend. That's it. And so, on the strength of that, he got us an obscene amount of money from the News of the World to do a three-part series. And I I said, oh, it's, the style is appalling, all the repetitive, I must admit this and that, and this kind of standards are so annoying. I said, no, 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 you can do, they lured me with a hypnotic kind of song of seduction, saying, no, no, you can do it. You'll sign every paragraph. Of course, the moment the ink was dry on the contract, the check was in the bank, the sub-editors rewrote the whole thing, and it became such an embarrassment. I was
Yeah.
at Stock's house at the time with Victor Lowndes, who said, "Oh my God, I said, how does it look, Victor?" He says, "Bad." And and then everybody, all these celebrities in the in the all over the conservatory. Everybody was reading the news was reading this stuff, and fortunately, it was scotched after two Sundays. The third episode never appeared, but it was bad enough to put a halt to my desire to reminisce in print. And so for years, this manuscript lay on the side, and I've reluctantly picked it up and looked at it and added a few things to it. And but I still got to finish the whole thing.
I hope you do. You've previously described yourself as someone who lived the dream many people fantasized about. So how has the dream been for you?
Well, it was mainly in Steppenwolf. Do you know the Steppenwolf of Hermann Hesse?
Yes.
There is a certain thing where you can have this wish, all the girls are yours. That was at the time my particular wish, and that came true to an amazing extent. And so this discovery of self through seduction, oddly enough, it's a Khalil Gibran illustration of how a man went digging for roots and found a treasure. It was a way to discover the fallacies of so-called intimacy in monogamy and things like that. That you're supposed to be that some things are considered shallow, and I've found brief encounters often to be some of the most intense moments of my life. And in so doing, I discovered a whole aspect of what you would call uh, the feminine divine in all its variations, and some wonderful things about what womanhood truly represents, which is far from this uh, bourgeois or petit bourgeois ideals that are cherished nowadays. And there is a neo-puritanical mentality, which is rather deplorable. So I'm glad that I lived the way I did and discovered the things I did, which also, along with my own esoteric studies, have led me to be where I am, where I'm able to play the part of myself as I can drive a superego, but I can also get into what I've termed the absolute elsewhereness of being, which is a, a state which is connected with the presence of the divine in everything, which is really it allows one to do things that you would think impossible. It allows one to play without to play music without thinking of what you're going to do, and it comes right every time. And it's surprising how it does it. It does it through one, if one places oneself in that kind of neutral spot where one is a receiver as opposed to aspiring to create from an ego position.
And what do you do with your music now?
Well, I'm recording. I've recorded a whole bunch of things before the pandemic. I'm continuing to record at the moment, but I'm recording. I'm recording things, on Baroque instruments, on things like that. I'm playing with counterpoint harmonies and things like that. I'm recording that as opposed to I'm quite far from pop music. I've written the occasional lyrics and so on, but I just don't have the interest anymore in ordinary pop music.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm certainly not necessarily interested in most things that are being played today, with exceptions.
Well, I want to finish with 5 by 5, which is 5 quick fire questions that I ask everybody while we're talking about music. Firstly, what is your favourite Rolling Stones song?
Heart of Stone, possibly.
What is your favourite Rolling Stones album?
Favorite Rolling Stones album? Probably Sticky Fingers.
What is a deep cut or underrated Stones track that you think deserves more love?
Oh, good question. Undeserved track. What could it be? There was a version, actually, I've heard something in the studio that is very different from the released version, which is Scarlet. Scarlet was very different than the version they've released, and it was much better.
In your opinion, what makes the Rolling Stones such an enduring and influential band?
They've never stopped striving for excellence, and they can really, really play well live.
And finally, if you could describe the Rolling Stones in just 3 words, what would they be?
In 3 words,
Mm-hmm.
probably the greatest band.
That's a good choice. Thank you so much, Prince Dash. I really appreciate your time.
Well, thank you, Simon. Thank you for having me and hearing the crazy stuff that goes through my mind.
It seems like a life well lived.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Please, if you haven't already, do go now and subscribe to Lip Service to keep up to date with episodes. Give us a like and spread the good word to anyone who appreciates the finest stories in rock and roll. Look us up on the socials. You'll find us everywhere at Stones Lip Pod for news and other little bits. Lip Service will be back soon with another episode. Till the next time, we say goodbye.